6 minutes to the gentleman from the great state of Maryland, and he is a former CEO of a public company which has brought great expertise to the Joint Economic Committee. Mr. Delaney.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the gentlelady from New York for yielding me this time to stand up and rise and speak out against Mr. Ryan's budget. And while I have many significant policy objections that are embedded in Mr. Ryan's budget, my main objection is based on the fact that the budget is built upon a fundamentally flawed analytical framework. And I think it's important to focus on that when we think about budgets, Mr. Speaker. The fundamental driver or the goal of the Ryan budget is to have our deficits at 0 in 10 years. And I believe Mr. Ryan does this because he thinks it's good political optics and it sounds good. The problem with this goal is it's fundamentally and economically and fiscally the wrong goal. It's unnecessary and it's unrealistic. It's unrealistic based on the fact of the demographics the country is facing. We are somewhere through the midway of this aging of the population that we like to talk about, Mr. Speaker, where the population of people over 65, of our citizens over 65, will double from 1980 to 2020 to 2030. This puts tremendous burdens on the federal government. But it's also an unnecessary goal. A 0 deficit is an unnecessary goal if you think about the basic math of deficits and debt. The reason our debt has grown to such a significant level in this country is because for the last several years, our deficits, as expressed as a percentage of the economy, have exceeded the economic growth on an annual basis for the economy. And the math of that results in a growing debt, which is problematic. And unless we change the direction of our debt, we will have very limited financial flexibility in the future, particularly if interest rates go up. But in fact, if we get our deficits to a rate below the rate of growth in the economy, then definitionally the debt in this country will go down. And most experts agree that we should be targeting deficits of 1 to 2% and economic growth of at least 2 to 3%. That will cause our debt to go down to historical levels and give this country the financial flexibility that it needs. So if you seek an unrealistic goal, or if you seek the wrong goal in budgeting and forecasting, you are forced to overcorrect. And there are 2 ways to overcorrect in budgets, or at least in the federal budget. The first way you can overcorrect is to raise taxes to an excessive level. The second way you can overcorrect is to cut spending to unrealistic levels. Mr. Ryan obviously doesn't choose to raise taxes. In fact, he cuts taxes, which is, again, an unusual and puzzling conclusion, particularly based on the fact that our tax revenues as a percentage of the economy across the last several years have been lower than the historical 50-year average for this country. So to think that we should be cutting taxes against that backdrop, again, is a puzzling decision. But since he chooses to cut taxes, he is then forced to overcorrect on the spending side. And to put this into perspective, in very, very simple perspective, the Ryan budget takes discretionary spending, things like education, infrastructure, investments in basic medical research, to 1.7% of our economy. And this in the context of an historical average for these same investments of 3%. So it effectively, and we can't really talk about growing or shrinking numbers in absolute dollars. We always have to talk about these numbers if we want any kind of budget integrity in terms of a percentage of the economy. He effectively cuts in half our investments in infrastructure, education, and basic medical research as a percentage of the economy as compared to the 50-year average. That's the overcorrection he does because he's trying to achieve a goal that is both unrealistic and unnecessary. And it's not clear to me, Mr. Speaker, as someone who spent his whole career in the private sector building companies, how anyone with reasonable cognitive abilities would think, in light of the challenges this country faces, to create jobs, as we've discussed, to compete in a global economy, and to transform our economy based on what's happening with technology, that it is the right answer, to cut our investments in research, in infrastructure, and education by half. That is the fundamental flaw in the analytical framework that is embedded behind Mr. Ryan's budget, which only reinforces my conclusion that this is a political document. This is not a substantive document. This is not a document that was created by looking at the facts, thinking about economics, understanding how deficits and debt interrelate, and what we need to actually make this country competitive, create jobs, and put ourselves on a long-term fiscally sound trajectory. So I yield back to my colleague. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.